All right, we're recording now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2017 Food 201 webinar for the Ecology Center's Health Leader Fellowship Program. The topic of today's webinar is less meat, better meat, or less meat, better meat, more options. We're going to get into it. Okay, so the agenda today is we'll go over what less meat, better meat is, and we'll talk about who our speakers are. We'll talk about food procurement and responsible antibiotic stewardship, and we'll go over a new report that's out to help us navigate complex purchasing situations where we're trying to reduce the amount of meat but still have options that are healthy for people and the planet. We'll have some time for question and answer and some ways to engage further after the webinar. So our learning objectives today, this will be in your evaluation. We want you to be able to identify 2 specific ways in which responsible antibiotic use in animal agriculture can affect human health. And we want you to identify 2 specific environmental or health effects of transitioning to a more plant-based diet. So it's pretty broad. You'll have lots of options. Okay, so, and I am speaking right now. I'm Lindsay Scalera. I am the Farm to Institution Campaign Director at the Ecology Center. And in this role, I serve as the co-lead of the Michigan Farm to Institution Network, and that includes our local purchasing campaign, Cultivate Michigan. And I'm also a regional organizer in Michigan for Healthcare Without Harm's Healthy Food and Healthcare program. So my role is kind of helping institutions, excuse me, institutions improve their efforts to purchase local and sustainable food. Excuse me. So we're really delighted today to also have Stacia Clinton on our webinar. And Stacia is the National Director of the Healthy Food and Healthcare program at Healthcare Without Harm. And just as a reminder, Healthcare Without Harm is a global nonprofit organization that work on a variety of issues related to climate change and greener chemicals and targeting the healthcare industry, specifically working through procurement. So Stacia leads a team of regional directors and organizers throughout the United States, and she's helping guide local and sustainable institutional purchasing and program development through all of our work nationally. And she also drives clinical advocacy and policy efforts to improve the food system through all of our regional and national efforts. So welcome, Stacia. And I think you're on mute right now, but we're going to turn it over to Stacia to talk about less meat, better meat, give us an overview of that. And then she'll delve right into our work on antibiotic stewardship. And I'm going to change the presenter. And I need to make sure Stacia's unmuted. How do we do that? Oh, there we go. Okay, Stacia, can you let us know that we can hear you?
Oh, I see. Oh, there we are.
Yes.
Can you hear me all right?
Great, we can hear you now.
Okay,
we can see
great. Oh, perfect. Okay, so hello to everyone. I'm happy to do this webinar today. It's an exciting topic and an important one at that. So to get us started, Lindsay gave a nice overview of Healthcare Without Harm. In particular, she mentioned we have multiple different program areas that really work to motivate change within the hospital environment so that those changes can then propel broader systems change. The Healthy Food and Healthcare program, which I have the privilege of directing, really operates on this concept of environmental nutrition. And as a trained dietitian, I really recognize and value the important concepts of traditional nutrition, which are in part of this environmental nutrition concept. So those are concepts like how much vitamins or minerals or macronutrients or antioxidants are included in any one food and how consuming that food then translates into good or poor health. But environmental nutrition evolves this to look at many aspects of the production, processing, packaging, distribution, even waste of the food, and how that in turn contributes to health. So when we're actually looking at whether a food is healthy or not, we're taking into account much broader concepts to ensure that the decisions that we're making are not only supporting individual health, but are also supporting public and environmental health. And when we take this approach, we start to look at the impact of our food production and, being driven by our food consumption patterns, and that impact on natural resources, and in particular our climate, recognizing that climate change has been acknowledged as one of the biggest threats to our public health in many different ways. And when we look at the contribution of food and agriculture to climate, we see that it is the second largest impact or contributor, second only to the energy sector. And in particular, that includes not only agricultural production, but land use as well. Primary sources of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are particularly high in the meat and dairy production, and also the manufacture and use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which are used to produce any kind of conventional crop, corn and soy in particular, corn and soy, which are used for animal feed. And so you can see there's a bit of a cycle there. We're talking not only about meat and dairy production, but we're also talking about our dominant industrialized agriculture system. This graphic here, you're getting a sneak peek at a draft graphic showing an important link between food and climate and the impact that that has on health. And these are really challenging and dynamic concepts. And so we're trying to create a graphic and create it in a narrative in a way that is really easier to digest by the general public. And so I'll walk through this here, just acknowledging that, we will have a more formal and finalized iteration that we can certainly share with you at that time. But to carry you through this graphic, consumption, really our demand for meat, is really what drives our current industrialized production. We need to produce a lot of meat to meet the needs or the demands of our current population at the rates that we're consuming it at. Our current, particularly our conventional industrialized meat production system, contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, as I showed you in that earlier graphic from the International Panel on Climate Change. And when the greenhouse gas emissions rise, we see lots of variation in weather, which translates into concerns for crop yields, whether that means that inclement weather or terrible storms or drought can threaten the viability of certain crops, which also translates into higher food costs. If we see higher food costs, we obviously will see higher rates of food insecurity. And with a well-documented link between rates of food insecurity and higher risks of chronic disease or exacerbation of current chronic disease, we see that direct health impact. So when I talk about that driving factor being our meat consumption patterns, we see that global demand for meat is rapidly growing. We see some estimates say near doubling by 2050. That's still acknowledging that in the U.S. in particular, national beef consumption has been reduced, but that's been compensated by a significant increase in poultry consumption. U.S. is among the top consumers in the world. If we look at average weekly consumption of meat, you'll see that here is, trying to get my screen so I can see the side here. You'll see that it is significantly higher than compared to the 26 ounces recommended by the American Heart Association, so our national nutrition and health professional experts. And then also, if we look at what we're actually eating, about 22% of all meat consumed is processed. And we recently saw, obviously, the designation of processed meat being considered a major carcinogen. And so when 22% of that, we can see, obviously, some concerns for translating into human and public health. This has not gone unnoticed. The 2015 scientific report of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, a compilation of our nation's experts in nutrition, public health, and nutritional science, come together every 5 years to distill current and available research, identify gaps, and then make the best informed decisions for the direction of the dietary patterns of our nation. This last year, taking into account this more environmental nutrition approach and acknowledging that we have a growing population with limited natural resources, the Dietary Guidelines Committee did acknowledge that regarding sustainable diets. A diet higher in plant-based foods such as vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and lower in calories and animal-based foods is more health-promoting and is associated with less environmental impact than the current U.S. diet. And so that's consistent with a lot of the well-balanced dietary recommendations we have, but that caused quite a political dynamic between the agricultural industry and these nutritional scientists, at which point the agricultural industry was able to lobby to have the composition of the final guidelines that address resource use and agricultural development or production removed. So one of the major focuses of Healthcare Without Harm is to provide opportunities for our nation's clinicians and healthcare providers to take action in really leading the conversation towards what our nation should be eating. And so you'll see here a couple of articles that have addressed that concern about that power dynamic between agricultural industry and nutritional scientists. So again, to reiterate, the root of the issue here is this overconsumption of meat is really driving these high production demands, which then supports the development of industrialized agriculture, which has created enormous efficiencies that allow us to have all of this food available for us. However, these efficiencies have been at the cost of public health. We've seen the overuse and mismanagement of resources, such as water or food that has to be used for animal feed rather than for direct human consumption. Land use, as well as the overuse and misuse of critical medicines like antibiotics. And just to reflect on why is there not a significant amount of action around this? Well, one is this lack of awareness around how agricultural policies really are health policies and driving kind of the outcomes of our public health. Of course, anytime we're embracing any changes in food consumption, we are up against motivating food choice behavior change, which is always a challenge. And then again, the reflection on kind of the work of the meat industry to maintain the status quo. They have some profitability needs. And so, of course, they have an investment in keeping the demand for meat high. So where are we headed? And so this is going to be kind of a very high level touch upon a concept called regenerative agriculture. And the interesting thing is that this whole concept is not a new one. It goes back to kind of fundamentals in farming and agricultural production, where you use the natural skills of the land to help to create efficiencies and crop production and high nutrient density in the foods that you're producing. However, because of industrialized agriculture, we've moved away from this towards using external inputs. So regenerative agriculture really, again, returns us back to looking at the soil health. And as a result, we're finding with emerging research that the soil's ability to actually sequester carbon is something that is now being researched in much more depth. So, and this includes things like using cover crops or composting, rotating crops, so it's not just all one crop year after year, and integrating the production of livestock into crop rotation so that you're using the natural manure management and fertilizing of the field rather than having to use the external inputs. So the concept that not only can this practice minimize the impact on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, but it can potentially reverse it by sequestering additional carbon, puts a very positive opportunity on the very controversial climate discussion. So as I mentioned, research is still emerging on what particular pieces of those production systems have the greatest impact. So what can we do in the meantime? Well, Healthcare Without Harm released a program in 2008 called Balanced Menus, which falls upon this concept of less meat, better meat in terms of shifting our purchasing patterns in healthcare, but also to stimulate consumption pattern changes more broadly in the public. And the concept is really this, that if you reduce meat on your menus, you are ultimately reducing your greenhouse gas emission footprint. So you're having benefits to environmental health. And as a result, you're also impacting your budget, with meat being a major contributor or a major kind of high budget item on a food service operator's line item. In addition to that, there's also the benefits of reducing those meats that have the highest impact on human health through consumption. With that cost savings and kind of with re-envisioning the plates, you can transition those purchasing over to what we consider better meat. And that's what I'm going to dive a bit into more today. And first and foremost, what I think I'll emphasize today is this kind of the use of antibiotics in animal agriculture. While antibiotics is not the only issue with our industrialized agriculture system, it is a very significant prop for that system. And so in looking at addressing the use of antibiotics, we have the opportunity to have the marketplace and consumers more broadly ask more deep questions about how their meat is produced and how that impacts their health. But to dig into this issue in particular, you'll see that there's two circles on this graphic. On the right side, you're probably much more familiar with the clinical side, the use of antibiotics to treat illness and how that might perpetuate the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So I'm going to focus on the left side, which is really how the amount of antibiotics that are provided in animal agriculture. And they're provided for many reasons. One, namely being that they are a preventative measure for disease to compensate for the fact that in industrialized agriculture, a significant amount of animals are in very close quarters, which can perpetuate the development of bacteria in general. But as a result of the use of these antibiotics on a regular basis, those bacteria tend to be resistant to multiple classes of antibiotics. Then as a result of those, the animal's manure, that can get into our waterways. It can be used, if untreated, as fertilizer for other crops, which then can be brought forward to humans, whether they are exposed to that through the food itself and through handling, or through air, water, and soil. One important misunderstanding, and you'll note that I didn't mention in here, is the actual consumption of antibiotics through our food system. And we're not actually concerned about antibiotics being in our food, or otherwise known as antibiotic residues. The FDA has some strict guidelines on the testing of meat or animal products before release into consumers for the levels of what we call antibiotic residues. And so those have been pretty well managed. What we're more concerned with, again, is the overuse of the antibiotics that then generates the resistant bacteria that then humans are exposed to. Important distinction there, even for the clinical professional community. When we look at overall use, we see that 70% of antibiotics are used in livestock for what we consider non-therapeutic purposes. That can be growth promotion, prevention, and so on. You'll see that that's compared to the 6% that are used for actually diagnosed illness in livestock, and the 9% that's used for human therapeutic uses. So we really need to be looking at this 70% if we're going to curb the use of antibiotic resistance and slow the growth of resistant bacteria. And what this really translates to, of course, this is the whole picture of antibiotic use, is that we are seeing increasing rates of antibiotic-resistant infections that are causing significant thousands of deaths, whether it's in the United States or internationally. Additional illnesses that we don't even acknowledge in full depth yet, and kind of how that affects quality of life after the infection, as well as other social costs, like direct costs, $20 billion to treat these resistant infections, or up to $35 billion of indirect costs here in the US alone. And maybe most concerning is that even though in the past maybe 5 to 7 years, we've started to draw more attention to this issue, that just this last year had found resistance on the farms to carbapenemone, which is a last resort antibiotic, broad spectrum, used when all other else antibiotics have failed. So how are we addressing this? Well, Healthcare Without Harm really embraces this concept of a comprehensive antimicrobial stewardship. Others have kind of called this a One Health approach. But the idea is that in the healthcare setting, we often talk about antibiotic stewardship programs, which have historically relied upon clinical policies to curb use or prescription in humans. In our concept, we're talking about the opportunity to not only in those policies embrace those that will address the purchases of food that the hospital purchases to drive broader market change, but it also stimulates changes that the hospital and health professionals can have more broadly in the marketplace, whether through consumer education, through their own policy engagement, or through their own purchasing. There is, as I mentioned, over the past 5 to 7 years in particular, been an increasingly amount of collective action around this topic. You'll see the United Nations has formed a coalition working on this. Center for Disease Control has its landing page, and over the last couple of years in particular has added education and awareness around use in animal agriculture. There are a numerous number of both state medical societies, hospital association, and other health professional societies that are starting to embrace position statements around antimicrobial stewardship that include judicious use in animal agriculture. And of course, there's a variety of nonprofits and coalitions working on this as well to push on different leverage points, whether it be in policy or in the marketplace. In addition, Healthcare Without Harm participates in the Infectious Disease Society of America's Stakeholder Forum on Antimicrobial Resistance, which really brings together a multifaceted groups, many of those listed here, to think through strategies where we can collectively push on policy levers here in the US around antimicrobial resistance. Primarily a focus for that committee is providing support and continued implementation and funding for the executive order that was passed under the Obama administration around antimicrobial resistance and the development of the National Strategy and Action Plan. This was a really fundamental plan of action to address antimicrobial resistance here in the US. And what is needed next is current funding for the implementation. And so as of right now, the conversations with our policy leaders and the advocacy efforts that we've been involved with have been ensuring the integrity of that plan and implementation plan, as well as ensuring the continued funding of that work to move forward. One of the most exciting and important developments takes us beyond the United States to the United Nations, whereas last September they held a critical high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance, where the Director General acknowledged that AMR is not a problem just in our hospitals, but needs to be addressed on our farms and on our food too. And in particular, very eloquently put forward that we need to cut down on the need and the use of them through good farm hygiene. So acknowledging that really how we are raising our animals is perpetuating our need to use these life-saving medicines. This led to a really groundbreaking political declaration by all member states to go back to their own countries and develop their own antibiotic stewardship action plan. To date, we have recognized that about 65 of the member states have already put forward an action plan. The remaining member states that have yet to put forward an action plan have been acknowledged as those that are struggling a little bit financially, and so they need to think about how to take action in considering any sort of regulation of their market. So it's a challenging and dynamic conversation. If we look at the history of antibiotic use in food animal production, I don't want to go through each one of these points, but will provide you with my slides if you want to dig in deeper. But really, you'll see here how on different findings about the multi-use of antibiotics beyond just disease treatment had perpetuated both the use and then the subsequent regulation of antibiotics in animal agriculture. What I want to draw your attention to most is the last bullet here, which is where we are today, where in 2010, the FDA began efforts to voluntarily end the use of growth promoters by 2017, this year. So it's essentially saying that all medically important antibiotics that are used in animal agriculture production can no longer be used for growth promotion purposes. And that's an exciting development. However, there are some limitations here, and we'll talk about that. So in particular, the FDA, after putting forward this voluntary guidance, articulated two core principles that would need to be achieved. So again, one, that these medically important antibiotics should be used only for diagnosed illness in animals. And that diagnosed illness can only be diagnosed by a veterinarian. It's what is called the veterinary feed directive. It's when a veterinarian can say whether or not an animal can receive antibiotics. And that's important. And I think those are critical, but it's only, you'll see this regulation is only as strong as the language in the veterinary feed directive. And some concerns we have in potential is that while it removes the use for growth promotion, there is still the allowance of using it prophylactically and a widespread use for disease prevention. And guidance and regulation around what is meant by disease prevention currently doesn't exist. And so when we look at the amount of antibiotics used in food animals, we see that 23% have these labels that overlap the use for both growth promotion and disease prevention. So essentially, if a company was going to follow this guidance, which all of them have currently complied, they're basically removing the language that they are now using that for growth promotion and continuing to use it in the same way for disease prevention. So lots of research is being done now on what the duration limits and the use for disease prevention should mean to strengthen that veterinary feed directive. And then the last piece I will mention around this is that this really pertains to the use of medically important antibiotics or those antibiotics that are used for human medicine. What it doesn't include is classes of antibiotics that are currently not used in human medical care, such as a class called ionophores. There's been some emerging research and some significant research being done. Dr. Lance Price is one of the leaders of this work, looking at a concept called gene transfer, where the development of antibiotic resistance through classes of antibiotics not even being used by humans can develop or perpetuate or accelerate resistance in kind of a bacteria that would be more relevant for humans. So it does create the concern that any antibiotic use can perpetuate the development or accelerate the development of resistance, and we have concerns about that. So for that reason, healthcare without harm does not differentiate. While we see the most urgency around the elimination of medically important antibiotics for kind of widespread prophylactic use in animal agriculture, we encourage the elimination of all antibiotics other than for diagnosed illness in a sick animal. So policy, as you know, has fits and starts and moves quickly sometimes and then can have setbacks significantly. And so our approach is to also move the marketplace forward through critical education that really emphasizes interacting with the healthcare community, who can then translate that into the general public. So you're looking at a graphic that we provided as part of an activity a couple of years ago to get hospitals in their own environments, whether it's in the cafeteria or in their doctor's offices, to post something like this to start to bring awareness around the connections of antibiotic use in agriculture. What Healthcare Without Harm is most well known for is through our network of over 1,500 hospitals in the US alone. We work to aggregate the demand of healthcare and then translate that demand into the marketplace to motivate changes in production practices. In this particular instance, these hospitals, these 9 health systems came together, looked at their purchasing and acknowledged that $34 million collectively was spent on meat and poultry annually. They then brought that forward in a press release stating that there was a need for the industry to come and meet their demand for $34 million that's available there, but make sure that they met it with meat riz without routine antibiotics, and that there was a gap in availability that needed to be filled. As a result of that, there was numerous outlets, both in agricultural industry outlets as well as the more general public, where these hospitals received recognition for their leadership in putting forward this request and this ask. And in particular, these facilities were well positioned because they themselves had taken on their own resolution to transition to meat riz without routine antibiotics, with these hospitals collectively reaching upwards of 60% of all of their current meat purchases meeting that specification. To support some of this work, because it is quite tedious at times, weeding through the labels and understanding what's out there, and the meat and poultry label, food labeling isn't as clear as we would like it to be. So what we have done is created some key resources to help hospitals in working with their suppliers to identify these products so that they can prefer and purchase them. Here's an example of one. We lay out the current meat and poultry label claims, talk about what that means and which categories of meat that falls into. This is important and something that unfortunately is frequently changing. And so we update this document regularly, and you'll see the link here to where you can find it on our website. In addition to this, we've started to gather some names and products that are specifically being purchased or available to hospitals nationally that meet the basic or baseline criteria around their use of antibiotics. This, again, doesn't get into that broader picture of what we're talking about when we say this broader, better meat system that encompasses all of those different factors, but it does take an important first step in helping hospitals to identify products or to go to their distributors or suppliers and say, do you have any of these products available that I can purchase? In addition, there's an important kind of collaboration needed where healthcare is only one piece of a very important consumer picture. And so Healthcare Without Harm works to align with other organizations working on this issue, whether it be those working in retail environments, such as the collaboration of nonprofits that pulled together this report, really evaluating the use of antibiotics in the meats and the policies that they had supporting their use of meat raised without routine antibiotics in various popular retail outlets. So this is a resource that can be, again, translated into consumer education. And I guess what I'm going to kind of wrap up here is talk a little bit about this opportunity for clinicians in particular within the Healthcare Without Harm network. 3 years ago, we formed the Clinician Champions in Comprehensive Antibiotic Stewardship Collaborative in partnership with the Pediatric Infectious Disease Society and a national network of antimicrobial physicians that are based at pediatric hospitals and run those antimicrobial stewardship programs in their own facilities. This group of leadership clinicians came together, noting that they would do their part to advocate for public policy changes. They would look towards institutional food purchasing policy development to help guide their hospitals as being leaders in this. They would work to educate their peers and the public, and then also some who had strength in research would work on some of these research gaps, building an important link between the healthcare research community and the agricultural research community. One of the primary events that we're known for within the CAUSE Collaborative, and we call it for short, is action around the CDC's Get Smart About Antibiotics Week. This is the week before Thanksgiving in November each year, where the CDC creates sort of a coalition effort where any organization can sign up to take action and create awareness around the use of antibiotics and the need to curb use both in clinical and in agriculture. To give you an example of some of the activities the group has come up with, the first year, the steering committee of the CAUSE Collaborative thought that it might make sense for us to bring awareness within the health professional community and have each individual clinician make their own commitment in their own lives. And so we had them pledge to actually purchase turkey raised without routine antibiotics for Thanksgiving and to have an important conversation with their family about why they were doing so. That led the groundwork to the next year where clinicians actually wrote a letter to leadership of either their affiliated hospital or hospitals in their neighborhood or region, requesting them to take action to set forward a procurement policy to phase out the purchase of meat raised without routine antibiotics in their healthcare setting in alignment with their clinical stewardship goals. As a result, 23 clinicians from 14 different states sent letters to the listed hospitals here asking for that action. And just this last year, the CAUSE Collaborative pulled together to create a guidance resource to assist clinicians in telling their experience based on available research and facts, but really telling their personal experience with how they've had to deal with antimicrobial resistance in their own clinical settings, how that's affected their ability to provide quality care, how it's affected the healthcare costs, and maybe what they've seen in their own lives. But of course, being substantiated with current facts around issues related to antimicrobial resistance. So this resource was provided prior to Get Smart Week, and then physicians were asked to submit their stories in preparation. We created a social media buzz and released those stories with permission during Get Smart Week to bring awareness around the impact that it's having. We also charged clinicians to think about how else they could use their stories, whether that's in policy testimony with their legislators or with their administration. There's lots of ways to really tell personal experience about how a real public health issue is affecting you as an individual and a clinical professional. And last but most importantly, these 3 years of the Cause Collaborative coming together articulated a need for a really grounding of the education of the healthcare community around the contribution of antibiotics in animal agriculture to resistance. The release of this toolkit module was released just this spring and follows the CDC's core principles of antimicrobial stewardship, but actually applies those principles through the lens of food procurement strategies in hospitals. So it goes through the roles and opportunities of clinicians, pharmacists, allied health professionals in tracking and benchmarking their progress towards removing meats raised without routine antibiotics, translating that into healthcare costs and potentially show the return on investment, as well as promoting and educating both each other, their healthcare community, as well as the broader public. So I'll end by just mentioning that, I mentioned in the very beginning, we talked about how antibiotics is an important prop up for this broader industrialized animal agriculture system, which it is. But we acknowledge that if we don't look at this from a systemic perspective, we could have some other challenges on our hands. Namely, some of these articles I've left here in this important report shows what other practices are happening within animal agriculture that are of concern, and that the industry, in looking at removing antibiotics, is responding to that particular request, but they're adjusting by potentially using other important medicines like beta agonists or others that may cause other public health concerns later down the line. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about approaching better meat and bringing this awareness to your colleagues and in your hospital setting. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you, Lindsay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Stacia. I'll point out that while we're transitioning, thank you, Mara. Oh, yes, you can see my screen. That in the handouts, we have that toolkit, the Cause Collaborative toolkit, as well as the Environmental Nutrition Framework publication and the purchasing considerations that I will talk about in a few minutes. And then I want to remind folks that if you have questions as we go, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, go ahead and put those into the chat or to the questions box. And we have some time at the end to answer those, hopefully. All right. And all of the resources, we'll make sure you guys have a copy of the, getting a preview there, of a copy of the slides, and some of the other resources will be in your course pack. All right. So let's dive into less meat, better options. Nope, less meat, more options. So if you are like me, you have been at the grocery store standing in front of the eggs and like looking at all the labels and all the logos and trying to figure out, what do I buy? I don't know. What does all this mean? Even with all the work that I have done over the years on sustainable and local food, I still sometimes feel paralyzed about trying to make a decision. Because I have values and I have a lot of information, but sometimes it's hard to kind of line it up and figure out what's the right choice. And so if that's tough for me, you can imagine that it's pretty tough, to do that same kind of decision making in a large system that has a lot of demands. What we try to focus on is the fact that every institution, they have their own unique set of priorities and challenges and values. And that tends to determine what food they're purchasing, how much of it they're buying, and where that food comes from. And we kind of call that, when you combine really knowing what your values are with that environmental nutrition framework, we talk about that as being values-driven food purchasing. So the question, I think for, our hospitals that we work with is, how can we identify options? What do we know? How do we navigate this really complex food system and identify options that allows us to design a plate or a menu that minimizes those negative impacts, but also helps promote healthy communities, given all of our constraints. So my colleagues at Healthcare Without Harm, Healthy Food and Healthcare Program, this year released a new report and an accompanying a purchasing considerations tool to help hospitals do just that. It's to assist in that decision making and navigating all these complex things. So it covers the following food groups: legumes, nuts and seeds, eggs, seafood, and dairy and the plant-based alternatives. And we're looking at those things in relation to all of these different impacts: the human health, environmental health, labor and social justice, as well as animal welfare. Those are all really complex. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to dig into those impacts, and then we'll talk about some of the recommendations from the report and in the purchasing considerations. So one of the things I want to mention is that human health is environmental health. When we can't really separate them, because a lot of those impacts that are listed below there, not that are environmental impacts, they also affect us, affect human health and public health. So what we have now is, like Stacia mentioned earlier, we have this industrial agriculture system, and there are a lot of health concerns, environmental and human health concerns that go along with it. So we're going to go over most of those. I'm not recovering antibiotics because we just heard about that, but we'll talk about some of these other ones. All right. So let's start with climate change. When we're talking about food systems and animal agriculture, human diets are contributing to climate change, mostly through the emission of greenhouse gases. That happens throughout the whole food system, the whole cycle. And what we're focusing on here is agriculture, because it's one of the pieces of that cycle that has the largest climate impacts. And you can read more about the details of all of these things and check into all the resources we use to create this report to learn, to dive into each of these issues and the food products a little more. So I'm going to kind of swing through this. Generally speaking, when we're talking about climate change, grains, legumes, plant-based material or plant-based food products are going to have a slightly lower climate impact than animal agriculture, and that just has to do with how we're doing things. But there's a lot of other things that go into it. Oops, wrong way. Sorry. But I just want to point out that animal agriculture, I think. Oh, sorry, that's the next slide. Let's go into land use. So there's all these other factors that go into what contributes to climate change. When we're talking about that, one of those things is land use. And the production of animal-based foods are what is the majority of the diet-related land requirements. What we found in creating the report is that it can be more meaningful to actually break down land use by the type of use and what that land is being used for, and kind of looking at what animal agriculture practices are in use to really understand what the impacts are. So grazing lands and pasture, those areas may not be arable, meaning you can't grow other types of crops there. But there's things to consider, like land clearing, deforestation to create grazing lands that may affect all of these other environmental, they're sort of interrelated with climate change and other human and environmental health effects. Arable land, how much arable land are we using to grow animal feed and to prop up and support animal agriculture? And then what kinds of animal agriculture practices are in use, because they'll have different impacts. So Stacia mentioned that integrated crop livestock systems are going to have maybe even a more positive impact versus some of the more conventional ways of raising animals and growing food. So shifting towards a less meat-heavy diet and maybe more towards a plant-based diet can reduce the demand on land clearing, which is one of the leading contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss, which we'll talk about later. So water use. This is really complex because the impacts of water use really depend on the location, where that food is being raised, what the product actually is, the infrastructure that's available, among other things. But the report goes into this in a little more detail, but what we're looking at is the water footprint and trying to get a sense of, plant-based foods and animal-based foods and what has a higher footprint. And generally, it depends again on the type of animal agriculture you're using, because if animals are being raised entirely on pasture, they're going to have a lower water footprint than a confined animal feeding operation where water is being trucked in and being used in a lot of different ways, a higher water footprint. Another consideration, though, is that plant-based foods, they also use water in the processing and packaging. So that's another thing to kind of consider. But in general, we can say that animal-based foods are going to have a higher water footprint than plant-based foods, but there are some exceptions. So fertilizers. The use of fertilizers has increased over the last century. It's really only been a century since we've been using these type of synthetic man-made fertilizers. And manufacturing them actually has a very high greenhouse gas footprint in itself. It's very energy intensive. Another concern and impact that we have around the use of fertilizers is that they can degrade water and air quality and contribute to climate change in other ways. And they've led to things like toxic algae blooms because they sort of change the ecosystem and they have an impact on the natural services that are ecological systems that we rely on. A few other considerations are the sort of geopolitical, troubles that we can get into when we're mining finite resources in order to obtain, the raw source material for these fertilizers, and exposure exposure to these fertilizers, the use of them and the effects disproportionately affects marginalized communities. For example, Latinx farm workers. All right, pesticides, another troublesome thing. So we know that, over the last century, again, pesticides, they can improve yields and the quality of crops, which allows farmers to, sell more, grow more and sell more. And they've indirectly kind of improving food security and affordability. But when we look at the trade-offs of the environmental and human health risks to using pesticides, it's pretty concerning. So what's happening is their exposure to these pesticides affects both farm workers, the nearby agricultural communities, the folks that live in those areas, as well as the sort of biodiversity and ecosystems that come into contact with them. So there's, surface and groundwater contamination, which leads to threats to sort of non-target organisms. So we may be spraying a crop, like you see there in the picture, but it's getting into streams and rivers and forests and all that kinds of stuff, and affecting other types of animals that we actually kind of need to be part of a balanced ecosystem. So one of the big ones that folks talk about a lot, that is a policy concern, I know, in our local community here, as well as others, are, for example, neonicotinoids. And they're considered to be one of the many contributors to the decline of pollinator populations, especially bees. And if we're looking at our own global food security, just as humans and wanting to survive because we can eat, 75% of our food crops depend on pollinators. So we're really threatening our own food security by the use of these pesticides. So we're going to touch on biodiversity. I've been mentioning it a few times. Biodiversity is something that it contributes to the resilience of our ecosystem. And there's a lot of good things that come from having a biodiverse ecosystem. We get pollination, there's pest control, sort of natural systems, like Stacia mentioned, talking about the integrated crop and animal systems. There's water retention and soil fertility and enhancement of nutrition in our food that we get from biodiversity. When we come into contact with some of these other ways of industrial agriculture, we get effects on our biodiversity because of agriculture. So there's increasing genetic uniformity, so more monocropping and more genetic uniformity in livestock breeds, and that can decrease the resilience. So if we have all one kind of crop and it's susceptible to something like this, a good example is the Dust Bowl in the United States. And so with the kinds of practices we're using, we're clearing biodiverse lands, we're losing soil management practices that have been in place for 12,000 years. In general, we're decreasing our own resilience. So we talk about social justice. One of the things we really consider here is that industrialized food systems, while they have maybe made food cheaper, they've also contributed to decline in value of wages and loss of autonomy throughout the food system, both for farmers and for communities. Really what we're looking at when we're talking about this in the report are, how are workers and nearby communities exposed to, different illnesses and infections, including bacterial or antibiotic resistant infections, other types of contaminants and toxic chemicals, as well as like higher rates of stress, poor living conditions, and things like that. So there are some real concerns there for the health of our communities and some human rights concerns. There's also, this is like too much to get into right now, but a lot of like global inequities when it comes to trade and sovereignty. And we can recommend some good things to dig into to learn more about that. But we're also losing, loss of indigenous crops and language and ways of living. So these are all things to think about. And Stacia mentioned the studies going on, and I wanted to reiterate that. A lot of the studies, we need resources to continue to study these sustainable practices and ways to protect biodiversity. And so that's something that's also threatened. And finally, animal welfare as a potential impact. So that rising demand for meat, like Stacia said, that's a root cause for this rapid industrialization of animal agriculture. And that's leading to, confined and crowded living conditions, little opportunity to exhibit natural behaviors, increased incidence of stress, illness, and physical pain for animals. So these are some things that we're concerned about and want to be able to make decisions around. So, and knowing that these conditions and these impacts don't only harm animals necessarily, they also can harm human workers and surrounding communities and affect public health. We do want to point out that animal welfare concerns aren't just for conventional farms. It's sort of any animal agriculture operation. It's something that should be considered. Okay, so let's dive into some of the purchasing considerations. The report, like I said, is pretty comprehensive, and I really encourage you, if you have a particular interest in any one of the products, the food products, or any of those impacts that I just went over, you can really dive into that in the report. But the purchasing considerations tool is really helpful. It's a way to get a good overview and start thinking about how to plan. And we talked about values-based decision making. This tool gives you some information on how to kind of apply that environmental nutrition framework while you're coming up with your purchasing priorities at your institution, or how you can talk about this with folks at your institutions or your colleagues. And there's a sample timeline in there, and so things don't have to change overnight, but it gives you some ideas of what you could start looking for. So we're going to go over some of those things. So we've got legumes. I'm not going to talk about the nutrition pieces on this slide. You can dive into the report for all that stuff. And I figure a lot of you are dietitians, so you might already know some of these things. But I will talk about the sustainability and social aspects. So just as a review, because I know not everyone knows this, legumes are, it refers to plants that have a fruit enclosed in a pod. So if you think of like edamame, a few other things, peanuts are technically legumes in this report because of how they're consumed. We kind of lumped them into the nuts and seeds. So we'll talk about peanuts later. But a lot of dry beans, like you see here, cranberry beans, that kind of thing. Fresh peas, those are legumes. So sustainability, legumes are a great part of crop rotation. And they're when they're incorporated into crop rotation, they are part of improving soil health. And they can be, and you do see more and more, even conventional growers taking that into consideration. So when you're making purchases, try finding those legumes that are grown in the US to help support farmers in making those decisions, to include that into their crop rotation. And I wanted to point out that Michigan is a top producer of black beans and cranberry beans, among a few others. So you can learn more about how to procure Michigan dry beans in our Cultivate Michigan product guide, and there's a link there for you. So soybeans are obviously a big concern, and because they're kind of everywhere. What we kind of offer is that if you pay attention to the genetically modified crops, and the reason is no matter where you sort of fall on the is GM good or bad, and that's genetically modified, those crops are definitely linked to increased use of pesticides in production, and obviously that leads to some negative health impacts and environmental impacts. And a quick note on importing legumes. We recommend that you try to purchase through fair trade systems. It's not perfect, but it's one of the most promising ways to kind of identify a more socially responsible product. All right, so nuts and seeds. So sustainability concerns, conventionally grown nuts and seeds require pretty high inputs of pesticides and fertilizer. And there's a big concern around water use, especially when it comes to almonds in California. So if you look through the report, you'll see some notes about that. And I included some in here. So when it comes to minimizing the impacts of fertilizers and pesticides, we encourage folks to choose organic nuts and seeds when possible. And, thinking about those, including those in the diets in moderation. So for social products, this is the same thing. Purchasing fair trade when possible is important. All right. We're going to go to eggs. So eggs are obviously a big purchase. Eggs and egg products are a big purchase at many institutions. And I forgot to put it in here. I'm sorry. We'll include it in the course pack, but we just released our egg purchasing guide, our Cultivate Michigan egg purchasing guide, that includes some further information on where to find Michigan eggs and how to understand what the grading means and some of the label claims. So when we're talking about sustainability of eggs, it's important to recognize that really the majority of layer hens that are being fed on conventional diets. So when we talked about land use and pesticides and fertilizers, all of these things kind of go into that system. So the feed production for layer hens can be being fed conventional diets can increase the use of pesticides. We really wanted to point out that, again, that integrated animal crop systems, hens can be a big part of that. And that I think it's good if you want to learn more about that to read a little further in the report, and there are some other resources for that too. But when it comes to social concerns, really what we're looking at with eggs are the way animals are raised and kind of how they're housed, because the vast majority are being raised in what we call battery cages, and that is slowly changing. But those battery cages, they prevent hens from performing natural behaviors. They're housing hundreds of thousands of birds in one facility, and workers in those facilities, they tend to be exposed to increased health risks that we talked about earlier, and they might be like poorly ventilated and things like that. That's actually what that should say. Sorry, poorly ventilated facilities, and there's other health risks associated with that. So a lot of farms, you might have noticed, are transitioning to what they call sort of cage-free housing. There are some good and bad things about that, impacts-wise. We kind of listed out the lowest to the highest standards here, so you can kind of get a sense. So there's from battery cages being the very lowest standards to the enriched colony cages was like a newer thing, which is sort of a slightly modified cage system, to cage-free, which means there are lots and lots of chickens in one large housing unit. They may or may not have access to the outside. To free range, which means that they probably have access to the outside. There's not necessarily specific limitations on how long and when. And all the way to pasture range, which means they are out on pasture doing natural chicken behaviors. And so there's a lot of information about all of those things out there. And if you have questions, we can talk about it later. All right, seafood. Our our biggest, sustainability concerns around seafood has to do with pollutants and outpacing demand for fisheries, and sort of what the impacts of aquaculture can do. So we have a growing demand for seafood. People want to eat more seafood. We are already outpacing the capacity of natural fisheries. So there is that wild caught piece. However, there's still, work to be done around policies and practices to sort of curb that. And it really starts with our demand. Aquaculture, so farm raised, it really isn't mitigating the problem because the demand keeps growing. And then there's other concerns around antibiotic resistance with aquaculture. And another thing to consider is air transportation. So wherever it's being farmed or caught, it's getting airlifted to different places all around the world. And that's a higher greenhouse gas footprint. So there are some really difficult sort of concerns there. What we came up with is if you can prioritize, domestic wild caught options when possible, you're going to help. You'll be making some mitigating decisions there. So it can help increase the diversity of the marketplace, and also providing that local market to help communities. And so that there are some labor concerns with it. It's a really dangerous job. I wanted to touch on really quickly, and a dangerous job, not just in the wild caught options. It's dangerous for those same sort of environmental health risks associated with other farming or farmed fish.
I think we might have lost audio.
Oh.
Let me chat it out to everyone.
So, okay, because it's recording.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll keep going, and Mara is letting folks know that we might have lost audio. But since it's recording, I'm going to keep talking. So I want to point out pollutants from human industrial activity that accumulates in seafood. That's a big concern, especially for vulnerable populations. So I want to point out that we're going to have an Eat Safe Fish webinar. And I didn't put the date in. Do you have the date? We'll make sure you know about it. But we're going to have an Eat Safe Fish webinar. And Healthcare Without Harm has a great seafood guide to take a look at. All right, I'm going to keep going. Oh, see, no, I'm not connected anymore. I just changed it to dairy. It's the internet.
Our phones would be connected. Lindsay, can you call into your cell phone?
Yeah. Ooh, I'm going to borrow your little thing here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just in for a minute. Oh, you know what? Patrick's on his phone. Oh, he can't send a message. Shit.
And I can turn my hotspot on. Maybe I'll just do that real quick. Easier.
Or can Patrick send a message to everybody as an attendee?
Let me open it.
Here, I'm going to turn my hotspot on.
Because I can do it where we unmute him.
Oh yeah.
Come on, buddy. Hotspot. There it goes. Let me see if I'm reconnected. Let's see. Wait, did it connect? Oh, hi everyone. Can you hear me? Wait. So we apologize. We lost our connection and now it's restored. So we're in the chat box. Okay. So I know Mara was trying to let people know. I'm not sure if someone could chat out what the last thing they heard me say was. And actually, maybe I will.
Seafood screen.
Okay. Oh, you did see the seafood screen. Okay, great.
It just went out for a minute.
Okay. I was just starting seafood. Okay. So we'll come back to that. Thank goodness for the Verizon hotspot. Okay. Let me just make sure. Okay. All right. Hopefully you can all see. Okay, good. So let's start that guy over again. All right. So what we were talking about are concerns for seafood. It has to do with demand outpacing the capacity of natural fisheries, and the fact that aquaculture is not actually mitigating the problem for a couple different reasons. It's not necessarily keeping up with demand overall, and there are other concerns about the process of the agriculture processes of raising fish. So there's even a concern for antibiotic resistance in aquaculture. Another thing to consider is that seafood's kind of being caught and transported, or raised and transported all over the globe. Air transport obviously has a higher greenhouse gas footprint. So those are some of the sustainability concerns. I also want to point out the pollution aspect of this. So human industrial activity, has released a lot of pollutants into the ecosystem, and that can accumulate in seafood. And we're going to have a webinar a little bit later this year. That Mara, the date is Thursday, June 29th. Thursday, June 29th. So stay tuned for that Eat Safe Fish webinar and to learn more about that. And in the meantime, take a look at the hospital guide for purchasing seafood from Healthcare Without Harm. One of the social options or the social considerations, we also know that there's labor risks similar to the impacts we talked about earlier. So we recommend that when you can, prioritize domestic wild-caught options. That helps diversify the market, support local fisheries, and hopefully responsible use of those local fisheries. And that's also for that. So I'm going to, oh goodness gracious, here we go, dairy. So this was, I think, our last category here. Milk is also a very large, purchase, protein purchase, and that's dairy milk. There have been some efficiencies around sustainability to reduce the climate, land, and water footprints of dairy production. So there's been some efforts to mitigate that. But what we find is that if you can hone in your purchases or limit your purchases from those really large-scale dairy operations, it'll have a bigger impact. And it will help also diversify the market and support local and regional farmers. When it comes to plant-based milk alternatives, one of the things we want to point out, this goes back again to land use and water use issues. Limiting almond milk procurement will help avoid increasing demands on almonds. California is where most of our almonds come from, and they're obviously experiencing water pressure issues. Water pressure issues. They have a drought, and so that's something they're working to figure out. And also, if you're going to purchase soy milk products, prioritizing organic is going to help reduce pesticide use in production. All right, I think that was my final thing. So I think we're now into the Q&A, and I do want to actually start with Stacia just to see if I missed anything. Sorry, I'm showing you all my screens. Make sure yes, hi, you can hear you. Yeah, so did I miss anything? Any other important takeaways?
No, I mean, there's a lot here. And for those of you who maybe have dug into the report that Lindsay is referencing, it is very detailed. And so, a lot of times we say after reading, your head is kind of spinning. And so digesting it and thinking about how to use it comes bit by bit. And I think hopefully we can talk a little bit about that today and more conversations to come on that.
Perfect. Thank you. So Mara, can you help manage questions? So do we have?
Yep.
Okay.
Do you want me to say it?
Yeah, if you can read it, because that'll be easier.
Sure. So the first question we have is how much almond is actually in 8 ounces of almond milk anyway?
That's a good question. Did everyone hear? I didn't hear you come through on my. You heard it. Okay, good. Sorry about that.
Well, I mean, I don't have a full expertise on that, but what I do know is that it varies from company to company, and that, the general, kind of when that's almond milk started to pick up in popularity, it became, it was quite aware among consumers, and kind of getting more and more skilled on kind of what's in things, is that almond milk had a very, very small percentage, lots of water in the actual product itself. So it's more of kind of like a concentration of the almond itself. And if you look at the actual protein profile, it's, next to nothing. The only protein or milk alternative or dairy alternative that has protein, substantial amounts of protein, is soy. So we, in the report, reflected on the fact that we're talking about plant-based dairy as an alternate to, cow's milk dairy, recognizing that the nutritional profile in particular is significantly different.
Thank you. So are there any other questions that folks have? We'll let you guys. Oh yeah, okay, so folks wanted to see the dairy screen again. Okay, so we have a request to talk a little bit more about milk. Yeah, could you maybe clarify, Barbara, what you'd like to learn more about?
Rice milk.
Oh.
Rice milk?
Oh, rice milk, sorry. I lost my screen, so I have to look at Mars. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, one of the limitations of this report in particular, and we mentioned this, is that in the beginning, it's a huge report trying to distill available research on different categories, and we had to make a distinction at one point what we were going to cover and what we weren't going to cover in this first iteration. And one of the important omissions, and one that we need to get to sooner than later, is grains. So grains being a major mainstay of a plant-based diet, and also contributing to some degree protein, depending on the grain that you're using. So for that reason, rice milk wasn't included either in this, because of the fact that we weren't evaluating grains at this time. But with a little bit more funding and more time, that's something we certainly want to tackle.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think, so I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer that question, but the questions Barbara clarified a little bit. So Stacia, you're the dietitian. I definitely know I can't answer this question, but when it comes to rice milk, so I don't know, it's not part of the report, so I don't know if we can answer the question at this time, but Barbara was asking about the sugar content, the protein content, different, maybe some of these plant-based alternative milks being good for kids or not.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, good question. So many of the plant-based milk alternatives were known to have additional additives in them, like sugar. And so now you're seeing an increasing number of them providing unsweetened varieties. And so that's the option you would want to go for, unsweetened, because they do add a considerable amount of sugar. No more than regular cow's milk, but it is a concern, especially if you're getting a flavored variety or something like that. It becomes, not even a valuable nutritional product because of the level of sugar in it. Protein as well. As I mentioned, soy milk is the only one that has a considerable amount of protein. And then whether or not to recommend for children or not, I don't see a concern personally as a dietitian in having children consume plant-based milks, but not if you're considering them replacing like an animal-based milk for the protein content. You need to offset that with protein to meet their adequate protein needs, whether that be through a grain or legumes or some other means. It's not an even swap for a cow's milk product.
Thank you. And we had another question here about the best way to find out if the milk or dairy products are coming from regional and small to mid-sized farms. So how would you even know? Which is a great question. And I've brought up our Cultivate Michigan milk poster, and we'll make sure that we put that in the course pack and the link to it. So this, when Cultivate Michigan first started a few years ago, we did a product guide for milk. And you can see here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Michigan is a big dairy producer. And we found that there's a way to find out if your milk is local. So there's the 5-digit code that shows up on every carton of milk. The first one is a state code. So you can find out what your state code is if you're not from Michigan. But ours is 26. And then there's a processing plant code. And I've done this before. And I guess we don't have the link, but there's a way to search that code to find out exactly what that processing plant is. And I think sometimes you can even find out down to the farm. And I wish I would have had that prepared for you so we could kind of do a little demo. But hopefully it's enough for you to kind of go on and take a look. The other thing is in all of our Cultivate Michigan guides, we offer both how to find that through distributors, through the broadline distributors that most hospital food service or other institutions would be using, like Gordon Food Service or Cisco. How to have how to ask for them what the product codes might be, and you can ask. But we also include some information in there on how to find a local farmer. So I should have opened that one up too. Sorry, here we go. Here's our guide. So you can take a look. We have some basic suggestions. So these are some of the item codes you could look into. They may have changed since this was published, but it gives you a sense of where the milk is coming from, what processing or packaging company, and what's available. And the milkmeansmore.org is a way to, reach out and learn more about Michigan dairy industry. And looking on local harvest is one of our general recommendations because you can find dairies, but they're everywhere. So you can, hopefully that helps you. Yep. So that's a good question. Are there codes for other dairy products like cheese? I am not sure. And goat milk. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so the report, the question was about goat milk and cheese. Is that what it was? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the report notes that the research that we distilled was on cow's milk because it is the dominant form of milk production right now. And so the analysis was done on that. And in terms of life cycle analysis and impact for goat's milk or other kind of animal product varieties, we didn't get into that. Again, we had to kind of draw a limitation in terms of the time and resources we had to do the report. Cheese as well needs additional critique. We talk about cow's milk and we talk about how the life cycle analysis applies to cheese, and actually it's a considerably higher greenhouse gas emission or impact on environment than cow's milk, and raises it up there with some meat production as well. So there's something to be looked at there. And then of course, any kind of processing and the kind of nutritional profile of cheese has been well documented. But for all intents and purposes, the analysis was done on the most basic contribution to dairy products, which is fluid milk from cow's milk. And we provide a reflection on kind of a plant-based alternative or the least resource-intensive alternative.
Thanks. Yeah. There's only so much time in the day to get to everything, but I think these are good concerns, and I think we'll keep working on that. And there was a question about codes and being able to identify, identify where your cheese is coming from, first of all, and if it was made with local milk. As far as I know, there aren't, but that we might need to get back to on that. So I don't know that you could go pick up a package of Kraft Mac or Kraft singles and find out what milk was put into it. But greater transparency in the food system altogether is something that we think is important. And what we focus on here is at that institutional level for our food service directors and nutrition directors to be having these conversations with their vendors, their food providers, and asking for source identified products is one of those things. And it has had some good impacts. For example, in Michigan, a couple of our real champions have made some progress working with their prime vendor, Gordon Food Service, to provide them a product line that comes from Michigan farms, and to be able to know where it was processed, and we're talking like minimal processing, like cutting carrots into sticks, and what farms it's coming from. Okay. Yeah. So it's all about continuing the conversation, I think. And for all these considerations, this is really meant to be a way to navigate these really complex issues, to just try to get a sense of how do these things align with the values that you have, and then aligning that with what other, sort of purchasing considerations you have, like who can we buy from, how much can we buy, how much wiggle room do we have, what can we put into our contracts, our future contracts, to prioritize some of these sustainability and social impacts that we want to see. And it's really important that you guys are doing that at your institutions with your colleagues. And it's also really important that the food purchasers, people making those purchasing decisions, are having those conversations with their providers and other champions at their institutions. And one of the other ways that we accomplish that is through some different market transformation things. And so we do have a group at the national level called Market Transformation Group, working through the practical challenges of this with some of the biggest purchasers, some of the biggest hospital systems and health systems in the nation, along with some of those really, really big food providers, distributors. So they're all working together. So we have another question. Oh, this is a good question that I'll see if Stacia knows the answer, but we may have someone who later can help answer this question. So there's a question about sustainable infant formula. So you guys remember from our Food 201 that Catherine Savoy mentioned that the production of infant formula also has similar negative impacts because of the inputs that are going into that. I don't know off the top of my head if there are any that that she might recommend, or if that study has been done. Stacia, do you know anything about infant formula?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what I know, but I do think additional research and some digging needs to be done. It's an area of considerable concern. There's a lot of crappy additives in some of the infant formulas, for lack of a better word. And then some of the basis of some of these formulas is, corn, soy from conventional agriculture systems, which have considerable concerns for environmental health, but also concern for neonatal or infant health. So there is some research out there about the composition of the main products, the corn and soy, but I am not aware of some good research on what they call, consider sustainable infant formulas. And I think that this is an area that is gaining attention at this time as a result of the work that's being done to try to transition production systems more broadly. So yeah, great question. And I think Catherine would be a great resource. She would be the person I would go to as well.
Yeah.
So this is Becca. One of the things that folks may recall that we're looking into here at the Ecology Center through our Healthy Stuff project is looking at what other environmental toxicants are found in infant formula. We're starting with phthalates, which you're going to hear more about on Wednesday when Tracy Woodruff speaks to the group. But we are testing a number of different brands of infant formula for phthalates, and so we'll be able to share a little bit of information there. But it's a complex issue, I think, is what Stacia is getting to as well. Like, we can test for certain chemical contaminants and give people information on better choices there, but there's this holistic picture of, what are all the other processes that went into production of that formula. On the other hand, there are certainly families that don't have any other options, and so if we can give some information for those families who don't have a mom who can breastfeed, we're hoping to be able to look at the food system, at least in terms of phthalates and pressure for better options there.
Yes, thank you so much, Becca. Yeah, more research forthcoming. Okay, yeah. Well, we're about to time, and so I think what we'll do is, if you have other questions, you can shoot us an email. And I did not put our emails in here, but you guys have my email. And we can always refer you to other folks. We'll follow up with Catherine about the infant formula question and maybe try to have an answer for you on Wednesday. And Mara is going to send out a link to the evaluation. That's where we're at. Oh, I'm sorry. We have to talk about engaging further. I was ending it without giving you options. Okay, so what you see here is a picture of fellows from last year. They hosted a blended burger, blended meatloaf tasting at Bronson Hospital. And pretty much everything in that blended burger came from local farmers, which is pretty cool. And hopefully we'll have a chance to meet all those folks over there at Bronson later this summer. But we wanted to give you a couple of quick tips. So in addition to some of the resources or reiterating some of the follow-up that came in our presentations, here's a couple of things. Definitely go check out our Healthcare Without Harm Antibiotics in Animal Agriculture page on our website. There's a lot of links, resources, and to toolkits and reading and stuff there. And I want to reiterate the Cause Collaborative and let folks know the things that Stacia was talking about earlier, getting involved in Get Smart Week. Those are really great practicum ideas, so keep that in mind. We definitely encourage you all to go check that out and join calls if you can. There's calls and there's some archived things too that you can take a look at. And I'll turn it over to Stacia if there's any other things or to clarify anything about Cause that I missed.
Yeah, Lindsay's right. We are at the time right now when we're looking to pull together a committee to help design Get Smart Week for this year in November. And some really exciting ideas were thrown out there by the committee. And so if you have interest in, whether that's going to be your project for your practicum or otherwise, there's an opportunity to participate in those conversations.
Great, thank you. And then here's a couple of Less Meat, Better Meat resources. Let's see here. The climate, I'm directing you to the Food and Climate Connection page because that's kind of at the crux of where we're at. There's a lot of really great resources there, and it takes you in a couple different directions. And that includes the links to this full report. But I also wanted to point out we have a great little article on Medium that kind of goes over the report and also directs you to some resources. So I think with that now, now we can actually close it out. Mara has a link to the survey, which is also right here. That's the evaluation. And again, if you have any questions, get in touch with us and we'll make sure you have the slides. And I want to take a moment to thank Stacia so much. I really, really appreciate you joining us on this webinar and for all your work and information that you shared. So thank you so much.
Sure. Happy to be here.
Yes, we really appreciate it. And you guys didn't know this, but Stacia just came from like a really grueling, massive conference last week. And so we're really appreciative of her being able to join us today.
Sure. Hopefully I was cohesive to some degree.
Yeah, you were. Absolutely. Okay. And I want to thank everybody for joining and for watching later when this is posted. And I think we'll call it. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week. And we'll see you on Wednesday at 6 p.m. 6 p.m. for the Toxics 201 webinar. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Mara, you're going to have to, I lost my